Okay, let's move on to the next album then, which is Galore, the third studio album from Bristol's grungy hardcore punk 5-piece, the St Pierre Snake Invasion. So this was released on Church Road Records and was sent to us by Sammy Unwin, one of the founders of the label. They're a pretty cool label. They've got lots of awesome heavy bands like Employed to Serve, Harriet, Slow Crush, Going Off, and a whole bunch more. So they're really cool indie label, worth checking out. So the St Pierre Snake Invasion is made up of vocalist Damien Sale, guitarist Patrick Daly, Jacques Notaro, I don't know if I've pronounced that right, bassist Sanjay Patel, and drummer Pete Reisner. So I knew this band from their debut album 100 Years a Day, which came out in 2015. I don't think I actually heard that when it came out. I think it was a couple of years later, and I think I just saw someone recommending it on a Facebook group. I don't know if it was like the That's Not Metal podcast Facebook group, or whether it was like a Reuben Facebook group or something. That's the kind of things I follow on Facebook, but that's how I became aware of them. The opening track on that album, Thanks But the Answer's No, is an absolute belter, and I listened back to the song When I See a Sycophant Fly the other day, and that's brilliant as well. I didn't love that album, but it kind of got me interested enough to like keep an eye on what the band were up to, kind of thing. So a couple of years later they released their follow-up album Caprice Enchanté, and I kind of followed the release of that album and listened to every single as it came out, and I was just like really excited for it to come out. And when it did finally come out, I was just completely head over heels with it. I wrote a pretty glowing review of it at the time, which you can find on theheadscratcher.com if you want to read that. But it's just a real gem. I described it at the time as harsh and pushy and angry, but also wildly inventive and dripping with grunge, doom and punk goodness, and with a mixture of slacker cool, punk irreverence and cave your face in aggression. So yeah, that record basically blows me away, and it just kind of felt more ambitious, more experimental and more complete than that first album. What's your relationship with St Pierre Snake Invasion? Have you heard their music before?
I hadn't heard of them before, so I really didn't know what to expect at all, to be perfectly honest with you, man. Yeah, I mean, the first song, Knackered Velvet, the opening bars begin with this kind of staccato spoken word type lyrics, which are kind of coupled with similarly kind of juttering and jarring drums and guitars to boot, which again kind of similar to the kind of Ren song that we were kind of talking about earlier on, I think might initially be off-putting for somebody who's maybe kind of unfamiliar with their stuff. But yeah, I kind of quite liked it. We were then kind of presented with this kind of quiet, loud type dynamic which continues throughout the course of the song and kind of continues along that kind of pattern, and then the song really hits its stride during these sections, with kind of chugging guitar, crashing drums and cymbals, which I just loved. I was just sitting here head banging to it while Kerry was sitting over to the right doing wedding stuff. I was just sitting like that. So yeah, that really kind of caught my attention. Obviously you're more familiar with this band than I am. I mean, does this album live up to your expectations?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it's been a while since that last album, and I think it probably would have come out sooner had it not been for the pandemic or whatever. But yeah, I didn't really know what to expect, other than it would probably push that experimental side even further, and I think it does that. I don't know if I still think I like Caprice Enchanté better than I do this album, but this is still a really strong album. The first 2 or 3 tracks really great. I mean, Cracked Velvet, it reminded me a bit of a Nine Inch Nails song to begin with, that kind of Trent Reznor style vocal, and then it goes into this like swarm of kind of grunge vocals and riffs. There's quite a lot of Nirvana in there, It's a really exciting opening song that kind of felt quite spontaneous, but at the same time without feeling too kind of disjointed or all over the place. So that's a really strong opener. The next track, Midas, had a kind of similar kick to it, but with a slightly more industrial feel to the drums actually, which worked well with those buzzing electronics. There's a bit of organ in there, some moody piano, nice little percussive touches here and there, like sort of chime noises, and like a wooden block kind of sound that reminded me of being in like sort of standard grade music class. Like you had like a wooden block and a thing to hit it, and it's like, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it was just a block of wood with a hammer you hit it with, and that was a thing. I don't know what you call it, the wooden block, I guess. But that's what it reminded me of anyway. It might have been a little more sophisticated, but it just reminded me of that. And actually, that song, there were elements of it that reminded me of a band that I was into as a teenager called Vast, and I think they're a sort of 80s band, but 80s kind of late 80s moving into like 90s. It's kind of a mixture of electronics and sort of moody soaring vocals that I think I'm getting from that. Like, yeah, that second track is really, really good. And then it's followed by Submeccano, which has got this just absolutely demented, like, spiky lead guitar line, and it just goes so hard, especially when the rest of the band kick in.
Yeah, so I think Submeccano was the first single from the album, or one of the first singles from the album. That was released in February, 17th of February. And you're right, like the guitars are all over the place. I've kind of written here in my notes, it opens with this kind of unwieldy guitar. It kind of put me in fact, I've written here, it kind of put me in mind of the guitar player in the latest Mad Max movie. Remember that guy who's just kind of bungee jumping? Yeah, that's what it reminded me of. Or this kind of almost this mechanical kind of juggernaut just kind of malfunctioning, seizing up and kind of juttering out and spewing out in all sorts of different directions. But yeah, I thought it was interesting. Like,
yeah,
Galore, that's the next track, I believe. So the album's namesake, initially a bit more somber and refrained. However, there's kind of the odd kind of guitar flourish that kind of hints at kind of what is to come later on in the song. I'm a big fan of kind of male and female vocals coupled together. See a kind of an introduction of that there. So I thought they worked really well. I quite enjoyed that.
Yeah, there's a really good like thrashy kind of beat down section in the last 30 seconds of that song as well. It just goes hell for leather basically. But yeah, the male female vocals on that song, and I think they do it again later on. I'm not sure which song it is that those female vocals come back on, but it's really good when it happens.
Yeah, is it maybe on Apex Prey? Possibly?
Yes, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is.
That was my favourite track in the album. I came across a really good article by a guy called Dan Hillier from Noise. So he did an interview with the lead singer, Damien Sewell, where they went through the track. We went through the album track by track, which is quite interesting, definitely worthwhile reading. That lyric, "You count your blessings, you count the days," I thought was absolutely brilliant, and he kind of talks a wee bit more about it in the interview itself. And he said that lyric was originally wrote that lyric in his teens, originally written about his father who worked abroad and how he used to count the days for his return. However, once he was in his 30s, the lyric kind of took on a bit of a new meaning, and it represented the envy he had towards people who were living a life that he felt he longed for. However, in the song Apex Prey itself, it relates to when his son had to stay in hospital for up to a week after he was born, and what with COVID restrictions and everything being in place, he could only see him for 2 hours, hence the kind of lyric. So the lyric therefore has kind of several meanings, is taking on a bit of a kind of cyclical nature, which then in itself is kind of, it's mentioned, I suppose, in the song itself with the lyric, "When everything is over, it begins where it ends." And I thought it was a kind of really standout track for me, and one that I really enjoyed. And again, back to what we're saying, it had that female and male vocals coupled together, which worked really well.
I like the track before that, the Overlook. I think it's got some of my favourite kind of vocal lines. They're quite soaring, a bit warbling at times, and then there's a bit more savagery and bite to the vocals in the choruses. And the lyric that goes, life is a thorn in the side of growth, spite is a knife in the spine of progress. I just find that to be really powerful. And then amongst these kind of angular electronic sounding instrumentals, like I'm not quite sure if the guitars or electronic synths or whatever, but they're either way they're pretty cool. And the drums are really massive on that song as well. Like the drums are really good all across the album as well. They really stand out.
Yeah, I'd agree. What was your thoughts on That There's Fighting Talk, which again is a pretty amazing title for a song?
It's a pretty amazing song title. It's one of the weirdest songs. It's got these sort of chanted vocals that sort of mimic the stab of the instrumentals. It's quite erratic, but also ends up being quite catchy in a lot of places. I do think it's cool, but it's not. Yeah, it's not my favourite track on the album, but I do enjoy it.
See, I can see what you mean, because so I wrote my notes and then I found that article that we were kind of talking about just there, and I've written it opens with this kind of unnerving, unsettling staccato type electronic flourishes which creates a real sense of unease. And then I went back and read that article, or discovered that article, and according to that article it's about the lead singer's past and his own emotional instability or irritability at times, and times where he's been victim to kind of violence or perpetrated violence himself. And knowing that now, that there's kind of parts in the song that for me kind of take on a bit of a new meaning. So there's kind of whispered lyrics at around the kind of 2 minute 30-second mark, which remind me of the idea of these kind of like irrational thoughts that sometimes kind of plague our minds when we're at our most vulnerable, and they kind of put me in mind of like having the devil and the angel on your shoulders and them kind of whispering into your ear. So I thought that was quite cool, actually.
Yeah, I think, and there's just lots of really interesting things all over the album. I've mentioned on a couple of different songs that there's like the odd Biffy Clyro vibe here and there, just the kind of the heavier, maybe not quite the sort of radio rock side of Biffy, the kind of heavier, more oddly timed kind of stuff. But
you like fucking with time signatures.
Yeah, and then some of the melodies and the vocals as well just sound a bit like Biffy. But the last track, I Pray to Liars, is one of the ones where I've kind of picked out a little bit of a sort of Biffy-esque melody, but it's also one of my favourite tracks, and it's got the screams of monetize the misery, for goodness sake, this is goodness grace, which is just one of the best lines on the album. Heavy as fuck, really melodic. There's the bit that goes, I pray to liars who bleed me dry, and that part I think reminds me a little bit of the Bats album that we covered like way back, like episode 4 I think it was. Just some of the erratic kind of heaviness of that sort of album. Yeah, there was stuff on here that reminded me of that, which is only a good thing.
Yeah. Again, kind of in reading that article, so apparently this song is about the music industry and the lead singer's opinion that they want artists to be maimed, riddled with addiction, suffering and damaged in some way, because that's what sells. Like the idea of the kind of tortured artist. So a bit like, I suppose, the sentiment or the idea behind the Lost Tapes of the 27 Club, the AI album that we covered previously.
Yeah.
So this idea, this song in this album is kind of set to kind of challenge this view and kind of wishes to champion the idea that the album is to act as kind of role model for future generations and allow them to realise that it's okay to take risks, make mistakes and grow because of it. So I thought that was a pretty cool message to kind of chuck in there.
Yeah, like the impression that I got from the name of the song and how heavy it was, and like that, the bit that says I pray to liars who'd bleed me dry, it just made me think of like just religion and the sort of
pomposity
if you think about like whenever you visit a city, the richest parts of the city are always the church, and it's like that thing about praying to liars who Bleed Me Dry just made me think of that kind of, they take everything from you.
The hypocrisy of it all.
Yeah, so that was kind of, without delving into it all, that was kind of the immediate take I got from it, which I really liked. But so
yeah, man.
So overall, what have you given this then?
I've given it a 7 or 8 out of 10.
I've gone for an 8 out of 10. Like I said, I'm not sure I love it quite as much as Caprice Enchante, but I still think it's a really good album and a worthy follow-up to that album.
Cool, man.
Okay, so that was Galore by the St Pierre Snake Invasion.
Before we move on, do you know where their name comes from? Have you looked into that?
I did. Not for this. I totally forgot about that. I just was taking their name for granted at this point. But I do remember looking it up back in the day, but I don't really remember.
So their name comes from an incident which occurred in 1902, whereupon Mount Pelée on the island of St Pierre in Martinique erupted, so somewhere in the West Indies, causing the death of approximately 30,000 people on the island and driving wildlife into the local towns below, most notably an army of snakes. I think in the article that I read it said like man-eating snakes, and I'm like, is there? Like, I suppose they do
like
sometimes.
Anacondas, like giant anacondas.
Yeah, pretty interesting. I don't know anything. I just read that. I don't know what happened afterwards.
I remember, I do remember reading that way back, and then I was like, it just reminds me of there's an episode of The Simpsons where there's like a day in Springfield where they go around like clubbing snakes. Yeah. And it's all because like Jeremiah Springfield back in the day like rescued the town from like an army of snakes by like clubbing them. So they all had like, it's like these sort of semi-amateur professional bowlers. They've all got their like nice bowling ball and everything, but this was like they're like clubbing stick like for the snakes, and it just reminds me of that. Which is probably loosely based on that. That story, the St Pierre Snake Invasion. So, I remember that finding that quite funny at the time when I learned that. So, it was a great name.
It's not finished. It's finished.